Good evening, dear insomniacs, my faithful companions of the sleepless kind. Welcome back to that quiet corner of the night where dreams won't come and neither will peace. You found yourself again inside a chamber where history breathes badly. Tonight, history won't lull you with glory or virtue. No, tonight, we descend through corridors of velvet, past gilded mirrors, into the perfumed filth of a palace that dazzled the world while quietly fermenting in its own stench. I must warn you, this one reeks, and not metaphorically. Tonight, we peel back the powdered mask of absolute monarchy and uncover the unspeakable truth of hygiene at Versailles, the era of King Louis XIV, the Sun King, who ruled from a throne made of gold and relieved himself in hallways. Yes, tonight is not about battlefields or revolutions. It is about the human condition in its most paradoxical state, the pursuit of perfection laced with decay. We are going to talk about poop, but not just any poop. Royal poop, French poop, the kind that mingles with musk, jasmine, and crushed violets. The kind that lived in shadows of chandeliers and haunted the folds of brocade gowns. This is the story of Louis XIV, he of the high heels, the grand ballets, the divine right of kings, and the famously stinking court of Versailles. A monarch who feared water more than insurrection, who coated his court in perfume because soap was for peasants, and who transformed bodily neglect into an art form fit for a god. But let us not rush. Let us not plug our noses too quickly. Let us walk slowly through the hall of mirrors, tracing the faint trail of civet musk and decomposing lavender sachets. Let us listen to the echoes of courtiers tiptoeing past piles of human waste, hiding behind marble columns, their silken slippers narrowly missing what chamber pots could not contain. Let us press our ear to the marble and hear the bubbling secrets underneath, the truth of hygiene under the Sun King, where the sunlight blinded, but the rot still festered. To understand the filth, we must understand the beauty first. Versailles was a stage. A set so elaborate, tricked generations into believing it was heaven on earth. Acres of symmetry, gardens like lace, architecture that defied the mundane. But behind this curtain lay a world of horrifying contradictions. Here, beauty existed not as a reflection of cleanliness, but as a weapon against it. If it sparkled, it was holy. If it stank, it was simply the smell of life ignored, denied, hidden under another layer of rose oil. And so the palace, with all its grandeur, became a crucible of scent warfare, a temple of masking rather than cleansing, a place where perfume wasn't luxury, it was necessity. Louis XIV was not merely a king. He was a myth dressed in lace. A man who transformed his body into a symbol of divine rule. But divinity, as you'll soon discover, does not sweat. It glows. And when it smells, it does so righteously. The Sun King famously bathed no more than a handful of times in his life. And those baths were not acts of cleanliness, but rituals. Theater. He feared water entering his pores and releasing deadly humors. It was a belief grounded not in madness, but medicine or what medicine pretended to be. Doctors warned that bathing, especially in warm water, opened the body to disease. So the king did what any sane man surrounded by terrified physicians would do. He avoided it. But his body, his body did not obey politics. His body lived. It sweated. It excreted. It decayed. And so began the elaborate ballet of covering the human with the heavenly. Layers upon layers of powder, rouge, wigs, and perfumes were deployed not to celebrate cleanliness, but to fight its absence. Underneath those towering wigs teemed lice colonies, fed on scalps that hadn't seen soap in years. Under the silken sleeves, arms blistered with scabies and sores. The court's perfume makers weren't artisans. They were the last defense line against olfactory catastrophe. The palace had over 700 rooms. Do you know how many bathrooms? None. Not in the sense we understand today. There were chamber pots, of course, but many preferred the corners, the stairwells, the fireplaces, behind tapestries. There are reports, eyewitness accounts, that describe courtiers relieving themselves in full view of others, with nothing more than a silk fan or a brocaded curtain to provide privacy. The king himself, surrounded always by attendants, relieved himself on what was called the chaise percée, a cushioned toilet chair, sometimes while discussing matters of state. It was not considered rude. It was considered efficient. But this was Versailles. What mattered was not sanitation, but choreography. Cleanliness was not a goal. It was an illusion. The king was bathed in scent, not soap. His shirts, freshly changed multiple times a day, absorbed the sweat he would not wash away. Courtiers were encouraged to do the same. To smell sweet, even if it meant rotting underneath. One lady of the court reportedly carried orange blossom petals in her bodice, not for seduction, but to mask the rank odor of infection in her breasts. These were not secrets. These were shared understandings. If your scent offended, you simply added more layers of perfume. A solution so widely embraced that perfume itself became a symbol of status. But oh, what a cruel perfume it was. Not the crisp modern formulations we imagine today, but potent mixtures of civet, scraped from the anal glands of civet cats, musk from deer genitals, ambergris, whale vomit, and floral extracts aged in alcohol and oil so strong it could stun a cow. And it had to be, because it competed daily with the omnipresent stench of rotting food, spoiled meat, and human waste. Versailles had no plumbing. The kitchen was so far from the dining room that food often arrived cold and spoiled. Rats were a constant guest. Chamber pots overflowed. And beneath all this ran a complex, unspoken ballet. To look divine while rotting, to smell like a garden while living in a sewer. This, dear listener, is not some moral tale. It is not a condemnation. It is a glimpse. A look behind the brocade curtain of absolute power. A reminder that even kings poop. Even monarchs rot. Even gods, when made flesh, sweat and stink. But what makes Louis XIV so uniquely captivating is not just the filth. Oh no, it's the grandeur with which he embraced it. It's the way he turned his excrement into theater, his odors into ritual, his decay into divinity. The court did not merely tolerate this paradox. They worshipped it. They mimicked it. They wore it on their sleeves. In a way, Versailles was not a palace. It was a perfume bottle, ornate, opaque, filled with unspeakable things, carefully blended, then sprayed generously onto the world. And so tonight, we're not here to mock the king, nor to pity him. We are here to understand, to sniff deeper, to follow the trail of rosewater and feces through a world where cleanliness was dangerous, and beauty was a disguise. A world where perfume triumphed over poop, not by removing it, but by dancing with it. So stay with me. Stay awake. We re-about to explore how a man who called himself the sun cloaked his rot in jasmine and musk, and convinced an entire nation to follow suit. You might find yourself laughing or wincing. You might gag a little. But more than anything, I hope you'll begin to see that history doesn't always smell good. Sometimes it reeks. And yet we inhale it anyway. Now let us walk deeper into Versailles. The mirrors await. The wigs are powdered. The chamber pots are, hopefully, empty. Let us begin the descent not into madness, but into musk, into mold, into the very real, very raw world of King Louis XIV and his perfumed court. Follow me. Let us begin not with Louis, but with the silence between his steps, the hush of anticipation before he entered a room, the split-second stillness as 1,000 eyes held their breath, waiting for the golden shadow to fall across the floor. It was in that pause, silent, suspended, sacred, that the mythology of the Sun King shimmered most brightly. For it was never just about the man. It was about the way the world bent around him. The way men and women stood a little straighter, smiled a little wider, and clenched their sphincters just a little tighter whenever he passed. Because to be near Louis XIV was not merely to exist in proximity to power. It was to become an extra in a living opera where every glance, every blink, every waft of odor might change your fate. And oh, how odor mattered. You might think I'm exaggerating. You might imagine that perfume was just another accessory, like silk stockings or powdered wigs. But you would be wrong. Under Louis XIV, scent was not a fashion. It was a weapon. It was a declaration of your proximity to the divine, a coded signal that said, I may stink like sin beneath this coat, but I belong to God's chosen ruler. Perfume was status, strategy, salvation, and it was necessary. Because the palace of Versailles, for all its majesty, was a rotting rose. A gilded carcass perfumed just enough to fool the casual visitor, but never enough to silence the truth. Versailles stank, not metaphorically, not poetically, but physically, viscously, persistently. The rot wasn't hidden. It was everywhere. It drifted through the air, embedded in the drapes, curled beneath the tapestries, clung to the lace cuffs of duchesses. It whispered from chamber pots tucked behind folding screens and lingered in corners where servants had relieved themselves hastily, with one eye on the corridor. And what did Louis do? He did not clean it. He outshone it. He overwhelmed it with pomp and powder and perfume, until the senses were too dazzled to register the filth. Cleanliness was not achieved. It was outmaneuvered. The Sun King did not rule through swords. He ruled through theater. And in his theater, his body was the sacred set. So what if it leaked and oozed and decomposed in the shadows? As long as it glittered on the stage, as long as the illusion held, the stink could be explained away as divine musk. You see, Louis had mastered the ancient alchemy of contradiction. He turned defilement into divinity. His breath reeked from rotting teeth. It was the scent of wisdom. His skin blistered under the weight of layers never washed. It was the cost of glory. His presence polluted the air with a complex cocktail of human decay and floral deception. That was power, darling. That was monarchy. But let's pull closer. Let's peel back a layer. Let's talk about his mornings. Louis XIV awoke not in solitude, but in ceremony. Every day began with a lever du oro, I the king's rising. It was a ritual more religious than royal. Between 20 and 100 people, depending on his mood and the importance of the day, would gather in his bedchamber to witness the sacred act of the king. Getting up. The great and the groveling all elbowed for position, eager to be part of the intimate ballet that was never intimate at all. The air was thick with expectation and body odor. The king, still rank from sleep and yesterday's sweat, would be approached by a valet holding a perfumed cloth. Not a towel, a cloth, often doused in rosewater or vinegar. This was his cleaning, a light pat, a gentle dab. Enough to suggest hygiene, not enough to offend his beliefs about the dangers of real water. Then came the clothes, the powdered wigs, the rouge, each item not merely worn, but performed. Perfume was applied liberally. Behind the ears, under the armpits, across the chest, sometimes on the genitals. Every fold, every crease, every festering orifice was sprayed, dabbed, disguised. Scent was not chosen for pleasure, but for potency. The stronger, the better. The more nauseating, the more noble. Louis liked musky, masculine blends heavy with ambergris, civet, and bergamot applied, not sparingly, but with the aggression of someone trying to suppress an uprising. Because under all that ceremony, the king's body was quietly betraying him. He suffered from a variety of skin conditions. Fistulas, sores, abscesses. These were not whispered secrets. They were part of the court's daily choreography. And yet, no one would dare recoil. No one would suggest he bathe. they would only reach for more perfume. His doctors were devout believers in the humoral theory, that ancient, wheezing lie which claimed the body was ruled by four fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Bathing, they argued, disturbed the delicate balance. It opened the pores, invited disease, loosed the demons of dampness. And Louis listened. After all, these men bled him regularly, inserted purgatives into his rectum, and once performed anal surgery in a public room, because they were certain that healing should not happen in private. His belief in their nonsense was not weakness. It was devotion to the theater of health, where pain was a performance and bloodletting a kind of divine punctuation. And so, the king lived in his body as one lives in a haunted house, with dread, with denial, with an endless parade of scented sachets to muffle the moans. He changed shirts several times a day, not because he enjoyed crisp linen, but because his sweat soaked through them with relentless insistence. His undergarments were not washed, but beaten and aired. Water remained an enemy, lurking at the edges of every basin, threatening to open his skin like a book and let death in through the margins. Versailles followed suit. The entire court adopted this anti-hygiene chic, like moths mimicking the glow of their burning king. Bathing fell out of favor. Washing became suspicious. The truly refined used dry cloths, vinegar rinses, and of course, perfume. The palace had no running water, no indoor plumbing. And yet it hosted thousands of residents, courtiers, servants, musicians, diplomats, and each one needed to relieve themselves. Chamber pots overflowed, excrement dried in corners, urine pooled under tapestries. And the solution? None. Occasionally a servant would throw sand or sawdust over the mess. Sometimes, if one was lucky, a window might be opened. The stench became part of the architecture. It infused the wood. It flavored the curtains. It hovered like a ghost over the grandest halls. Visitors commented on it with alarm and fascination. One ambassador from Spain reportedly gagged upon entering the palace, his stomach rebelling against the perfume-laced decay. But such reactions were considered provincial. At Versailles, if you noticed the smell, you simply weren't noble enough. One did not complain of rot in the Garden of Eden. One simply brought more roses. Louis XIV believed in discipline, but not for bodies. For images, he ruled through optics. And so he danced in high heels while pus wept from sores beneath his stockings. He hosted masked balls while his mouth oozed from untreated dental rot. He received ambassadors with breath so foul that some reportedly turned their heads discreetly to breathe. But what did that matter? He was the sun. The sun could not be dimmed by human stench. Even his lovers were not spared. He had many mistresses, many sons. But intimacy did not equal cleanliness. Madame de Montespan, his favorite for many years, was known to wear heavy perfumes and often fainted in her corset. Hygiene was not part of seduction. It was the price of it. To share a bed with the king was to accept the mingling of perfume and sweat, the collision of musk and mildew. It was to surrender your senses in exchange for proximity to power. But perhaps the most perverse element of all was how normalized it became. The human nose, you see, adapts. After weeks, months, years in an environment saturated with filth and flowers, the line between the two begins to blur. One no longer notices the stink. One begins to crave the sharp sting of civet, the sour sweetness of unwashed skin beneath violet powder. One confuses decay with desire. And this is the true triumph of Versailles. Not its architecture, not its diplomacy, but its ability to convince the world that rot was royal, that filth was fashionable, that the absence of hygiene was, in fact, evidence of elevation. And so the palace festered, and the king glowed, and perfume poured like wine. There's a certain cruelty in marble, not the kind chiseled into statues or laid beneath royal feet, but the way it echoes. A cruelty born not from intent, but from design. Cold surfaces reflect not only light, but sound, and in Versailles, it reflected everything. Every shuffle of slippered foot, every moan behind closed doors, every accidental gust of what ought to remain private. Sound traveled like scandal in that palace. So did odor. And where one could suppress a rumor with gold or death, the scent of waste needed something far more elusive. Collective denial. And denial, my dear listener, was the true architect of Versailles. It built more than walls. It sculpted reality. It carved corridors through which truths were not simply hidden, they were rewritten in perfume and protocol. Because how do you maintain the illusion of divinity when your sovereign cannot go an hour without the scent of human decay escaping his pores? You build a palace that teaches people not to notice. You teach them to bow instead of breathe. You instruct them, silently and without pause, that their senses lie, that their nose is vulgar, that their discomfort is treason. In this theater of denial, Versailles was not a failure of hygiene. It was a triumph of narrative. The hallways, wide and windowless, seemed designed not to accommodate airflow, but to trap it. There were no waste systems beneath the marble, no drainage, no underground mercy. Instead, there were servants. And when I say servants, I mean human sacrifices to a god who preferred not to flush. They scurried like ghosts with buckets, with ash, with bundles of herbs tucked into their belts, rubbing lavender against feces and praying the nobles wouldn't notice. But of course, they noticed. Everyone noticed. And everyone learned to pretend they didn't. They had to. Because if the Sun King did not stink, then you did not smell. If the palace was divine, then your gag reflex was sinful. And so people trained their bodies the way they trained their tongues, to flatter, to submit, to lie. Children were raised in the scent. They found comfort in it. Court ladies adjusted their fans, not for heat, but for odor deflection. Courtiers developed preferences, some finding that certain perfumes paired better with the musk of human rot, like wine and cheese. The human psyche adapts in extraordinary ways when power is on the other end. But not all power in Versailles wore brocade. Some wore aprons. Let us now descend beneath the velvet surface to the invisible world that truly sustained the filth, the lower servants. The petite pupil, the nameless hands that carried the weight of excrement on their backs, so that nobles could pretend they lived above such things. These were not just maids and footmen. These were perfumers, physicians, scrubbers, chemists, carpenters, rat catchers, and women whose entire job was to air linens without ever asking why they smelled like mildew and unspoken shame. They did not get fanfare. They did not get leverage. What they got, instead, was exposure to every boil, every bodily fluid, every scream during an anal surgery performed without anesthesia. They stood in the rooms after the courtiers left and tried, desperately, to erase what nobility refused to see. They were the true front line in the war against scent, and they were losing. Not because they were weak, but because Versailles was built for illusion, not for cleanliness. You see, the Sun King had a strange obsession with surfaces, with reflection. Mirrors, polished floors, golden details, all of it designed to reflect not truth, but aspiration. You didn't need to be clean. You needed to look immaculate. And so the palace shimmered while it rotted, shone while it reeked, was celebrated while it festered. The walls did not whisper, they screamed, but only to those who hadn't yet learned the choreography. Because there was a choreography, an unspoken dance of bodily denial. You relieved yourself behind the drapes if you were discreet. You excused yourself to a corner if no one important was watching. You carried your own perfumed handkerchief. You stepped lightly over puddles and never asked if they were water. You sprayed, then walked. You gagged only in silence. The courtier who vomited from stench did not return. The one who powdered his cheeks and smiled through the nausea found himself promoted. But perhaps the most sacred ritual of all was the toilette royale. Not toileting in the modern sense, but the king's daily beauty routine, a spectacle as sacred as any mass. His face was powdered, his wigs chosen like weapons, his scent blended with almost surgical precision. The perfumer, a man of incredible power, presented options with reverence, as though choosing not cologne, but destiny. And destiny always smelled a little like death. Because what do you think it takes to mask the constant discharge from a body ravaged by illness? What blend of flour and feces can render a man divine in the face of putrefaction? The answer, apparently, was layers. Layers upon layers of perfume. Louis wore different scents for different times of day. Morning musk, afternoon citrus, evening ambergris. Some say he preferred heavier scents during council meetings, perhaps to keep ministers too dizzy to object. His perfume didn't just enter the room before him. It clung to it after he left, like memory. Like guilt. It settled into the cushions. It hung in the velvet. It haunted the tapestries. Visitors often remarked that the king's chambers smelled like no place on earth, though few dared admit they meant it literally. And the royal bed? That holy site of conception, rest, and ceremonial death? It too bore witness. The linens were changed daily, yes, but washing was rare. Fabrics were aired, not laundered. Stains were masked, not removed. Every night, a new sheet. Every morning, a new illusion. And still, the stench crept through. Because the body, especially his body, refused to follow the script. He was often unwell. Not simply in the way monarchs are described when coughing, but truly unwell. Ulcers, dental abscesses, a famously infected anus that required excruciating surgery in front of spectators. These were not private afflictions. These were public sagas, poetic, almost. His suffering became part of his sanctity. The king bleeds, and yet the kingdom thrives. The king festers, and yet France flourishes. It was Christ-like, if you squinted, if you held your nose. Even death was not a reprieve. Because when Louis finally began to die slowly, ceremoniously, his body did not cooperate. It decayed before its time. His leg turned gangrenous. The smell reportedly drove attendants from the room. And still, the theater continued. Doctors announced that the king would recover. Priests offered prayers layered with lemon balm and desperation. Perfume bottles were placed around the bed, not as tribute, but as defense. The irony? Even in death, he could not escape the rot he had so long disguised. It rose up, proud and putrid, like an old lie refusing to die quietly. And when he was gone, when the court finally exhaled and began to whisper about hygiene again, Versailles remained. Still stinking, still gilded, still unwilling to admit what everyone already knew, that the most powerful man in Europe had lived in a palace of scented lies. That his court was a masquerade of mildew. That the smell wasn't just a footnote, it was the truth. Because scent is memory. It is the one sense that bypasses logic and implants itself in your core. You forget what someone said. You forget what someone wore. But you never forget how they smelled. And Versailles smelled like denial, like beauty rotting from the inside, like humanity begging to be seen beneath a mountain of powdered deceit. So the next time you look at a painting of Louis XIV, resplendent in curls and crimson, hand on hip like a god, admiring his creation, look closer. Try to smell the oil paint. Try to inhale the perfume embedded in that canvas. Try to imagine the space behind the curtain, behind the silk, behind the lace, where flesh met fabric and produced something unforgettable. That is where we are. That is what we study. Not kings, not wars, but the quiet rot that reveals more than power ever could. And we are only just beginning. There is a moment, if you linger long enough behind the velvet curtains of a myth, when the illusion no longer whispers. It begins to weep. Not loudly, not with tears, but with the subtle unraveling of everything it tried to hold together. And in Versailles, that moment came not with rebellion or fire, but with a rustle of fabric, a faint whiff of spoiled milk beneath orange blossom, a glance too long at a damp hemline trailing the floor. You see, the power of illusion is not in its grandeur, it is in how convincingly it ignores decay. And the moment someone remembers to look down, to sniff instead of bow, the spell begins to crack. Let us look down together now, shall we? Down at the embroidered slippers soaked not in holy dew, but in urine from the servant who could not find a chamber pot in time. Down at the gowns dragging through corridors, polished only on the surface, while the filth clung to the undersides like a secret. Down at the dogs, yes, the dogs that roamed the palace freely, peeing against tapestries, defecating near fireplaces, treated with more affection than most mistresses, and certainly more attention than sanitation. The floors of Versailles, like the ideals it claimed to uphold, were never as clean as they seemed. And this uncleanliness did not trickle from below, it emanated from above, sanctified by a king who believed that water invited death and perfume could replace repentance. But filth, like truth, rarely stays contained. It seeps. And it seeped most vividly through the women. To speak of the court of Louis XIV is to speak not only of gold and mirrors, but of bodies specifically, the bodies of women who bore the impossible task of appearing ethereal while surviving in a state of rot. They were the painted saints of a filthy religion, worshipped for their glow while their skin cracked beneath powder, their corsets cut into their flesh, their hair hosted colonies of lice nestled deep in wigs that hadn't been removed in weeks. Do you know what it means to live in lace while rotting beneath it? To seduce while stinking? Madame de Montespan knew. So did Madame de Maintenon. So did dozens of others whose names had been immortalized in portraits, but rarely described in the olfactory register. If you could sniff history like a dog, you'd find they reeked of desperation disguised as jasmine. Their smiles were painted over open sores. Their lips kissed rings with breath sour from untreated cavities and undigested game meat, and still they were expected to glide. The glide was everything. To glide was to deny. To float above smell, above sweat, above discharge and despair. To glide was to perform nobility as a kind of magic trick. Because you must understand, nobility was not about blood. It was about the ability to remain unmothered. If the king farted during mass, you bowed deeper. If the duchess fainted from the stench of her own rotting feet, you gasped in admiration at her delicate sensibility. The women of the court were masters of this. They lived in a state of constant decomposition, hidden beneath talc and tinctures, and they made it look divine. Of course, their bodies betrayed them too. The corsets, tightened daily by maids, whose knuckles bore the bruises of their labor, restricted not only breathing but digestion. Constipation was epidemic. Fainting spells were common not from passion, but from lack of oxygen. Menstruation never discussed, rarely managed, was hidden with layers of linen, often left in place for days, sometimes weeks, as the blood dried and fermented into the fabric. The resulting scent was not named, not acknowledged. It simply became part of the perfume of the palace. And perfume, ever loyal, tried to save them. Or rather, tried to save the illusion. Scent was applied not delicately, but like war paint. Behind the knees, between the breasts, inside the elbow crooks where sweat pooled and whispered the truth. Musk, rose, civet, amber, each note not chosen for beauty, but for strength. The court wore perfume not to seduce, but to survive. It was both shield and shackle. To reek of absence was to admit defeat. To douse oneself in layers of scent was to declare, I am still noble, even as my flesh revolts. Even childbirth sacred, feared, brutal, was conducted in this theater of rot. Louis XIV insisted on public births for royal women. Yes, public. Queens and mistresses alike gave birth in front of courtiers, ministers, priests. Modesty was forbidden. Witnesses were mandatory. And yet, hygiene was absent. The birthing chambers were not sanitized. Hands were unwashed. Instruments unclean. Infection inevitable. And when the women screamed, not from the pain of labor, but from the slow burn of sepsis taking hold, no one questioned the system. They only reached for more perfume. The children who survived were swaddled in linens sprayed with orange blossom, even if those linens had been soiled by previous births and merely aired, never cleaned. The wet nurses who fed them did so, with breasts caked in unwashed sweat, their own children forgotten in the villages from which they'd been summoned. Disease traveled from nipple to noble mouth, carried not by malice, but by the illusion that cleanliness was beneath them. Because that was the cruelest twist of all. Cleanliness was considered vulgar. To scrub, to bathe, to wash with urgency. These were the acts of peasants, of those who labored in fields, not parlors. Nobility was about distance, from labor, from pain, from the rawness of the human body. To acknowledge your own stench was to break the spell, and no one broke the spell. Not in Versailles, not while the sun still reigned. So the servants continued their quiet war. They aired, they swept. They threw powdered herbs into corners where waste dried like secrets. They crushed lavender into cracks. They burned vinegar-soaked rags to purify air that could not be purified. But they could not cleanse what the cork refused to see. And so they, too, became part of the choreography. Silent, sweating, disappearing into shadows, holding their breath not from courtesy, but from necessity. And beyond the palace walls, something darker brewed. Because while the nobility danced in their scented apocalypse, the common people suffered in filth without perfume. They too lacked plumbing. They too faced disease. But they did not have the luxury of denial. Their rot was visible, punished, mocked. Meanwhile, the palace's rot was powdered and placed upon pedestals. The stench of the elite was divine. The stench of the poor, criminal. This hypocrisy fermented like spoiled cream beneath the surface of the nation. And when revolution came, yes, I know we're not there yet, but don't you feel it pulsing beneath the perfume? When it came, it did not arrive because of tax alone. It arrived because the people had grown tired of pretending that their shit smelled worse than the king's. But that's a scent for another night. For now, let us remain in this palace of denial, this temple of olfactory warfare. Let us linger with the women who bled in silence, smiled through blisters, seduced while rotting. Let us honor their resilience, their cruelty, their complicity, because they too sustained the illusion. They wore their decay like diamonds. And in doing so, they taught the world something brutal and beautiful, that even in filth, there is power. That even as your body betrays you, you can still glide. That the difference between a beggar and a duchess is not cleanliness, but whether anyone dares to name the smell. There is something grotesquely sacred about repetition, especially when it stinks. Versailles understood this better than any cathedral. While monks chanted and bells rang in Rome, Louis XIV's court performed their own liturgy, a ceaseless rite of fabric, flesh, and fragrance that made holiness not a matter of virtue, but of velocity, how quickly one could glide past decay before it stuck. And yet, as we wander deeper into this labyrinth of rotting rituals, we must ask, was this performance for the world, or was it for themselves? Because when a lie is repeated enough, it becomes not just truth, it becomes sanctuary. Versailles was not merely a palace. It was a place where the powerful went to forget they were still made of meat. And no institution proved more complicit in this forgetting than the church. The Catholic clergy at court, the spiritual shepherds of France's most gilded sinners, were not blind to the scent. They lived in it. They presided over births that reeked of sweat and bile. They blessed marriages surrounded by guests, hiding the scent of digestion beneath musky clove and lily. They administered last rites beside beds that smelled more of gangrene than grace. And still, they spoke of the divine, of heaven, of cleanliness of the soul, as though spiritual purity could exist within filth if only the right prayer were whispered. God, they insisted, saw beyond the skin, but no one asked if he could smell what lay beneath it. Louis XIV, of course, considered himself chosen by God. His divine right was not a metaphor. It was a conviction soaked into every drop of rose oil, rubbed onto his chest each morning. And so the church bowed, not only to his throne, but to his body, accepting that sanctity could coexist with suppuration, perhaps even be born of it, because to cleanse the king would have meant to question God's architecture. And in this court, questioning was a far greater sin than stinking. So they prayed harder. They prayed for the sores to close. They prayed for the bowels to cooperate. They prayed for the stink to fade into incense. And when it didn't, they simply lit more candles. Confession, too, was a game of pretense. Behind screens, men and women whispered sins with mouths that hadn't tasted clean water in days. Priests absolved them not by washing, but by words. Soap could not erase what sanctified speech forgave. And so bodies remained unwashed while souls, allegedly, were scrubbed raw. It was a strange hierarchy, the soul elevated, the flesh rotting, and everyone pretending this was virtue. But that's how rot works best, when it's mistaken for righteousness. Even the architecture colluded. The chapels within Versailles were masterpieces of stone and sound, yet their pews held courtiers whose garments hid infected wounds. The velvet cushions bore the scent of bodies soaked in sweat and musk. Holy water fonts remained unemptied for weeks, the water darkened with time and touch. No one dared suggest it be changed. To do so might imply that even the sacred needed cleansing. And what of the physicians, the so-called guardians of health? They, too, bowed to the rot. The royal doctors, more sorcerers than scientists, operated on theories that viewed bathing as heresy. The body, to them, was not a system to be cleaned, but a balance to be bled. Illness came not from filth, but from imbalance of bile, of air, of planetary alignment. And so they prescribed enemas with lavender, fed the king mercury for syphilis, and applied leeches to cheeks already pale with infection. They wore long coats that brushed against floors, slick with effluence, and never questioned why the palace smelled like a dying garden. Their prescriptions were not solutions. They were performances. And the patient was not just Louis, it was the entire court, addicted to the idea that rot could be managed by ritual. It wasn't ignorance. It was faith in a system that placed image above integrity. And so when the king complained of discomfort, they gave him clove water instead of cleaning. When his stools turned black, they consulted the stars. When his skin split open beneath his corset, they advised thicker perfume. And the king believed them. He had to, because to admit the body was failing was to admit mortality. And Louis could not die. Not while the sun still shone. Not while the court still danced. His flesh could peel, his teeth could blacken, his breath could kill roses, but the crown would not tremble. Not as long as the scent of sandalwood hovered behind him like a promise. So the court inhaled, and so did the people beyond its gates. Yes, the peasants of France mocked the decadence of Versailles. They spoke of its gold and greed, but they did not know the half of it. They did not know that beneath the king's throne sat a box lined with velvet that served as a toilet, that his feces were collected by a valet who wore lace, that his sweat was scraped from his skin with ivory instruments shaped like feathers, that even his farts, pardon me, his royal winds, were scented with potpourri by attendants trained to act deaf and devoted. This was not hygiene. This was theater. A theater with no end, no curtain call, no intermission. Because once the performance started, no one could stop, not even the king. He was trapped in the role he'd written for himself. The divine monarch who never bathed, the perfumed god who never died, the glowing orb around whom the court revolved, even as it coughed and limped and bled behind closed doors. But every theater needs an audience, and Versailles had won Europe itself. Ambassadors came from England, Spain, Austria, the Ottoman Empire. They marveled at the architecture. They bowed to the king. But they also gagged, quietly, in hallways, behind fans. Some wrote letters describing the unbearable stench masked in jasmine. Others kept silent, afraid to seem uncultured. Because if France's greatest palace reeked, what did that say about theirs? And so the lie spread. Other courts mimicked the French style, not just in fashion, but in fragrance. The Russian court imported French perfume by the crate, unaware it was meant to bury bodily failure, not accent elegance. The Spanish court adopted powdered wigs while still battling lice outbreaks. Even the English, ever proud of their own filth, took cues from Versailles and began replacing soap with scent. The myth of cleanliness as perfume became Europe's new religion, and Louis XIV was its prophet. But prophets are still human, and one day, even the sun must set. When Louis began to decline slowly, then all at once, the rituals did not change. The curtains were drawn. The perfumes intensified. The doctors bled him, burned him, poisoned him in the name of balance. The priests prayed louder. The courtiers smiled tighter, but the scent could no longer be hidden. His leg, gangrenous, blackened and burst. His breath turned from sour to septic. His voice weakened, but the illusion held. They carried him from room to room like a relic, pretending the sun still warmed their backs, even as the cold of death crept in. And when he died finally, terribly, magnificently, he left behind a palace that still pulsed with his stench. For weeks, the rooms were unusable. The linens were burned. The perfumes ran dry. The tapestries were removed and beaten like sinners. But the scent remained, not just in fabric, not just in marble, but in memory. Because scent, once it clings, becomes history. And this, dear listener, is the part no one paints. They paint the throne, the wars, the lovers, the gardens. They paint the sun, but they do not paint the waste bin beneath his chair. They do not paint the stains in the queen's birthing bed. They do not paint the maid scrubbing feces from the hallway before dawn. But we remember them, here, together, at night. In the soft hush where truth lingers like rot, we remember. And that, perhaps, is our own rebellion. You see, by the time Louis XIV exhaled his final perfumed breath, the court no longer flinched at death. They flinched at silence, not because it was rare, but because it was dangerous. Silence meant something had broken, something within the machinery of spectacle had slipped, and Versailles could not afford breaks. Versailles, the most powerful lie ever built on a septic tank, survived on rhythm. One ritual bled into the next. One scent masked the last, one wound ignored another. So when the king finally collapsed into stillness, what echoed was not mourning. It was the dreadful realization that even gods, when left unattended, rot like everybody else. But the machine did not stop. No, it adapted. Because rot, once ritualized, becomes rule. And Versailles had long passed the point of hygiene being a preference. It had become a performance law. You did not wash because it was fashionable not to. You did not clean because filth was elegance misunderstood. And the deeper you leaned into denial, the more power you projected. Cleanliness was for the uncertain, the desperate, the unroyal. The court had absorbed its own poison so thoroughly that it no longer tasted bitter. It tasted like protocol. The stink had become a form of diplomacy. Foreign envoys learned to pack accordingly. Those arriving from the Ottoman Empire brought sandalwood and myrrh. Those from Venice, oils of citrus. The English, always a step behind in refinement and a step ahead in sarcasm, arrived with clove and irony, and yet none dared speak of what they truly smelled, because to acknowledge the rot was to offend not just the court, but France itself. And France, in the mind of the Sun King, was not a nation, it was his mirror. A cracked mirror, yes, but still gilded around the edges. This mirror reached deep into the psyche of his people, who had been taught to equate beauty with power and scent with salvation. Merchants sold sachets soaked in formulas said to be inspired by Louis's own collection. Apothecaries crafted candles based on the king's chambers, unknowingly recreating the scent of decay in wax. Households mimicked the palace not with marble, but with musk. They could not afford gold, but they could afford denial. And denial is contagious when inhaled daily. But let's descend even deeper, now into the pit of institution. Because nothing preserves rot like bureaucracy. Louis's court, a monstrous machine of privilege, required not just perfume to sustain it, but paper. Documentation. Classification. There were ledgers for every wig, inventories for every bottle of scent, receipts for every ivory-handled feces scraper used on the royal posterior. And none mentioned hygiene. Cleanliness was not the metric. The goal was opulence, consistency, continuity. You could have a festering sore under your breast as long as your gown matched the dress code. You could ooze from your scalp as long as your powder held through supper. The rot was logged, archived, and blessed. And what about the children? Ah, the children, those born into this perfumed prison, swaddled in musk before they could cry. What chance did they have to question the order? The sons of nobility were bathed in rhetoric, not water. Their education included Latin, fencing, theology, but never the anatomy of stench. They were taught to speak sweetly while reeking. They grew into men who could recite Horace, while their armpits blossomed with bacteria. They learned the art of kissing hands with lips chapped from dehydration, yet slick with rose oil. And the daughters, do not ask about the daughters, unless you are ready to ache. They were raised to float, to be fragrant furniture in the background of masculine power, to smile with bleeding gums, to marry with infected wombs. Their value was determined by dowry and obedience, not by vitality. And if they suffered silently, steadily from infections caused by unwashed linens, or the forced presence of disease-ridden husbands, they were simply offered stronger perfume, maybe a sachet of violet tucked into their bodice, maybe a new corset, tighter than the last, to hold their crumbling ribs in place. And when one of them died, and they often did, it was never the rot that was blamed. It was fate, God's will, delicate constitution, anything but the truth, that Versailles was a machine that ran on the sacrifice of flesh, and perfume was the oil that kept it quiet. You see now, don't you? This was not about Louis anymore, not even about hygiene. This was about a system so devout in its commitment to illusion that it could not smell itself dying. A system that punished the clean and rewarded the fragrant, that elevated denial to a principle of state, where ministers could soil themselves during court debates and be applauded for passion, while a maid who washed her hands too often was whispered to be unwell, where the scent of a rotting king became not a cause for concern, but a national identity. And so Versailles drifted, year after year, through clouds of jasmine and despair. Each passing moment another step away from humanity, another dance with infection, another masquerade against mortality. And all the while, beneath the music and marble, something was fermenting, not in the court, but in the minds of those who served it, in the eyes of those who saw the stains, in the lungs of those who could no longer breathe without gagging. Resentment, my dear insomniac. That's what was brewing. Because denial works only as long as someone is willing to clean up after it. And the hands that bore the burden, the servants, the porters, the nurses, the laundresses, they were no longer fooled. They smelled the truth every day. They scraped it from floorboards. They lifted it from soiled sheets. They carried it in their hair. They watched the nobles drown in their own filth and call it majesty. And they began to whisper. You think revolutions are born from books? From taxes? No, they're born from rot. From years of breathing what others refuse to acknowledge. From lifting chamber pots while your children starve. From powdering the feet of a countess who calls you repulsive while her toenails flake off from fungus. From being forced to pretend the stench is roses. That is how it begins. And though Louis would not live to see the blade fall, the scent of his denial lingered long enough to guide it. So now we sit here, you and I, at this fragile hour when the past begins to stir in its grave. And we inhale not perfume, not incense, but truth. Raw, rotting, radiant truth. That history is not a golden hall. It is a hallway slick with sweat. That kings are not gods. They are bodies. That beneath every crown lies a scalp, and beneath every wig, lice. This is not cynicism. It is intimacy. It is the recognition that the closer you get to power, the more human it becomes. The more it smells. The more it bleeds. The more it needs to be powdered, perfumed, and painted to maintain the illusion that it is not, in fact, dying. And that every one of us, whether we know it or not, has at some point bowed to a rotting god and called it beautiful. But tonight, we do not bow. Tonight, we remember. And yet, what haunts more than the stench itself is the question it refused to answer. What were they so afraid of cleansing? Because surely, no man, no king, no court, no empire remains buried and rot unless they fear what might surface should they finally decide to wash. The filth, perhaps, was never the enemy. Perhaps it was the vault. The final layer keeping something deeper submerged, something unbearable. The recognition that without the powder, without the perfume, without the orchestra of protocol and illusion, there was nothing royal underneath. Just skin, just shit. Just the human condition with its soft belly and sour breath. And maybe that's why they chose to perfume it instead of fix it. Maybe they understood that to fix it, it would mean facing the screen beneath the silk. Because Versailles was not ignorant. That lie is too easy. Ignorance can be forgiven. This was something else. This was the conscious decision to build a cathedral atop a corpse and light candles to the smell. This was the daily choice to reaptly musk over mildew and dare anyone to call it anything other than divinity. And so it wasn't just about Louis. It never was. The court had become a body itself, a single twitching, perfumed organism with no desire for healing, only choreography. And just like the king, it would rather rot beautifully than cleanse honestly. But rot is never content to sit still. It moves. And in Versailles, it moved not only in the ducts and folds of gowns and flesh, but in the mind. It curled into thought, into judgment, into what passed for etiquette, until even the rules of human interaction were steeped in bodily denial. To acknowledge someone's smell was an act of social war. To carry a handkerchief scented with your own custom blend was not just fashion, it was survival. To choose which nostril to breathe through while standing next to someone of higher rank became a form of courtly calculus, and the rules were cruel. If a baron stank, you bowed anyway. If a duchess passed gas during mass, you fainted from the divine presence. If a prince scratched a rash in public and flaked skin onto a banquet table, you complimented his appetite. And if a maid coughed blood, you whispered about her lack of breeding. Because rot, when wrapped in royalty, was mistaken for radiance. But rot from below, that was still rot. This bifurcation, that some filth was sacred and some was sin, was the venom that flowed through Versailles like a second bloodstream. It allowed the noble to weep pus in peace, while the peasant was punished for perspiration. It justified the scent of Louis's abscessed mouth, while condemning the baker for forgetting his lavender sachet. It was not about health. It was about hierarchy, and perfume was the mask that made it holy. Even the very architecture betrayed this. The palace, for all its grandeur, had no intention of hiding the filth from those who served it. The noble halls had no toilets, yet the gardens overflowed with latrines for the staff. The private chambers of royalty lacked drainage, but the basins of the laundresses reeked from being emptied too rarely. And always, the stench flowed one direction down. Always, the responsibility of noticing it, dealing with it, dying from it fell to those who did not wear brocade. And yet, it wasn't only an external cruelty. The court turned it inward too, because no matter how many layers they wore, how many bottles they emptied, they could still smell themselves at night. In the quiet, between ceremonies, under the heavy drape of brocade and expectation, their own bodies whispered truth. The rash on the inner thigh, the weeping blister beneath the powder, the ache in the gut that would not pass. And they feared it. Not just the pain, but what it implied. That maybe they weren't divine after all. That maybe their bodies had been telling the truth the whole time, and they had chosen to ignore it. So they clung tighter to the ritual. A little more perfume, a little less food, another robe, another prayer. Anything to keep the rot from speaking too loudly. Anything to keep from hearing what they already knew, that the king was dying, that they were dying, that the palace itself, for all its mirrors and music, was a tomb blooming backward, its roses fed not by soil, but by shame. And so Versailles did what every dying god does. It turned its death into doctrine. New rules emerged. Rules so absurd they could only be invented by those who feared the truth more than ridicule. Rules like no washing the face with water more than twice per week, unless ordained by a royal physician. Rules like powdered wigs being mandatory even in fever, to ensure uniform scent distribution during ceremonies. Rules like sitting perfectly still during dinner while your bowels churned from infected meat, so as not to insult the chef or imply that digestion was real. And people obeyed, because they knew the cost of breaking rhythm. They had seen what happened to those who refused the dance. The chambermaid dismissed for mentioning that a countess had bled through 6 layers of silk. The stable boy beaten for suggesting that a horse stank worse than the prince who rode him. The visiting scholar who fainted from the smell and was never invited again. You didn't speak of the smell. You inhaled it, swallowed it, let it fester in your lungs like second-hand sin. And if you were noble, you thanked God for the privilege. And if you were not, you simply survived, quietly, bitterly, until one day you didn't. And this, more than all the perfume, more than all the mirrors, more than all the sermons and silks, this was the true sickness. The system that taught an entire generation to distrust their own senses. That made them believe their body lied when it screamed. That convinced them that to speak of the rot was to betray the light. And by the time Louis died, that sickness had no name. It simply was. It lived on in powdered daughters and perfumed sons, in carriages that reeked of damp wool and fear, in letters sealed with wax that stank of mildew from long journeys through sickened air, in paintings that could not capture scent, but whose eyes still flicker with the madness of pretending. And now, centuries later, we look back with the comfort of detachment. We joke. We gasp. We marvel. But part of us, if we are honest, still wears the perfume. Still believes that image can replace essence. That to cover is to fix. That denial, if repeated beautifully enough, becomes history. And that is why we remember. Not because the stench lingers in stone, but because it lingers in story. Because the same impulse that powdered Louisa wounds lives in the boardrooms that praise presentation over integrity, in the algorithms that reward filters over flaws, in the families that smile in photographs while bleeding in private. We are not so different. We've just swapped musk for marketing. But you, sleepless one, you chose to stay awake. You chose to follow the trail deeper than comfort allows. You chose to inhale the truth, no matter how thick. And that, perhaps, is what makes you dangerous. Because those who remember the rot can no longer be ruled by roses. By now, perhaps, you've begun to notice that the story has changed shape, not because the facts have shifted, but because the silence between them has grown louder. That's the thing about filth. It doesn't always scream. Sometimes it hums. Sometimes it sits patiently beneath the velvet, beneath the marble, beneath the skin of history itself, waiting for anyone to stop pretending. And what was Versailles, if not one long, unbroken act of pretending? Pretending that royalty was immune to the human condition. Pretending that rot could be aestheticized. Pretending that a kingdom built on denial could ever escape the collapse that always follows too much perfume. And yet, the collapse did not come all at once. Because before a palace falls, it forgets how to breathe. It suffocates not from invasion, but from the accumulation of what it refuses to exhale. That was the real scent of Versailles accumulation. Not just of feces in stairwells or of unwashed bodies in brocade, but of fear, of performance, of centuries of men and women dressing their decay in beauty and calling it tradition. It was never about cleanliness. It was about never letting the illusion crack. And the deeper that illusion was buried, the more sacred it became. Which is why, in the final years of Louis's life, the rituals only grew more elaborate. He could barely walk. He could barely eat. His leg, gangrenous, oozed into his stockings. His mouth reeked of internal death. And still, he was powdered. Still, he was perfumed. Still, the grand lever and couture were performed, even as the king soiled himself in his bed. Still, ministers whispered beneath the stench rather than above it. Because by then, to acknowledge the smell was to betray the state. And what is a state, if not the smell it allows? Even Louis, through fevered breath and glazed eyes, seemed to understand that he had become something beyond man, no longer human, not quite God, but the scent of a system that could not afford his death. So they kept him alive with incense and pageantry, dragging his decaying body through ceremony like a relic through a dying church. The priests prayed louder, the doctors bled deeper, the courtiers bowed harder, and underneath it all, the king leaked. Leaked memories, dignity, blood, and pus. His body had become a confession booth that no one dared enter. And still, the palace applauded. That applause, that sickening, echoing applause, is the sound I cannot forget. It wasn't joy. It wasn't even reverence. It was desperation. The last gasp of a world that had made peace with its own decay and could not bear to face the cleansing flame. Because the end of Louis was not simply the end of a king. It was the end of a performance that had gone on too long, the final act in a play that refused to bow. And like all things that refused to end, it began to rot from the inside out. The rooms that had once sparkled began to echo with the emptiness of forced reverence. The tapestries clung to mildew they could no longer hide. The windows stayed shut longer. The perfume thickened. The gardens, once geometric and perfect, began to fray at the edges, as if the hedges themselves were trying to crawl away. And the servants, the only ones who truly understood what was happening, went about their duties with a kind of hollow resignation. They had scrubbed this palace until their bones creaked. They had wiped and dumped and aired and gagged and powdered. And now they stood knee-deep in history's greatest lie and watched it turn to mush. You might think I'm being dramatic, but only because you've never stood at the edge of legacy and watched it melt. Only because you then never smelled what reverence smells like when it is 3 days past death. Only because you weren't there, under the gold leaf and chandeliers, as the Sun King's body decomposed into a godless bouquet. He died surrounded not by silence, but by choreography. Even his death had to follow the script. No screams, no mess. The body was treated like porcelain, even as it blackened and swelled. Ministers took notes. Valets wiped without weeping. The bed linens were changed with the same care as one would prepare a marriage altar. And still, the stink leaked through. Because there are some truths that not even gold can seal. The autopsy was discreet, the announcement polished. And the body, dear God, the body was sealed in lead. Not out of honor, but necessity. Because even in death, Louis refused to be humble. He would not rot quickly. He would not rot quietly. He would not give the world the satisfaction of seeing what they already knew. But his court? His palace? They rotted loudly. Because now there was no anchor. No mask strong enough to cover the scent. The rituals continued out of habit, not belief. The perfume hung in the air like a ghost of obedience. The walls, once filled with music and flattery, now echoed with the coughs of courtiers trying not to choke. The new king, young and nervous, wore wigs that didn't quite fit. He bathed slightly more. He hesitated before the mirror. And the palace? Oh, the palace knew it was being haunted. Not by Louis himself, but by the scent he left behind. That scent wasn't just musk and mold. It was grief. Grief for a system that had made rot sacred. Grief for a world where no one had dared breathe deeply for fear of what they might smell. Grief for the lie we all tell ourselves, that beauty is clean and power is pure, and gods do not sweat. But they do. They sweat, they bleed, they rot. And when they die, they leave behind not just monuments, but mildew. Not just myths, but maggots. And those who survive must choose. Do we build again atop the rot, or do we finally wash? Versailles chose to build again. But history, if you lean close enough, will always remember the smell. And so the sun set, not in flame, but in fermentation. The marble remained. The tapestries clung to the walls. The perfumes stayed uncorked on gilded shelves. But there was no more light behind the mirrors. No more God beneath the silk. The palace had devoured its king, and now it sat bloated in silence, a mausoleum still pretending to be a ballroom. The dancers had not stopped, not exactly, but the music was hollow now, played more for habit than joy, like a lullaby sung to a corpse. Versailles, once the heartbeat of power, now pulsed with the sour rhythm of decay that could no longer be denied. And those who lived within it did not admit it aloud, but they knew. You could see it in their eyes. They all knew. Because rot does not vanish with its host. It lingers. It seeps. It trains the air to remember. And the air at Versailles remembered everything. It remembered the urine stains behind the tapestries where the nobles pissed between dances. It remembered the sweat-soaked silks of mistresses who fainted beneath the weight of corsets and courtship. It remembered the shrieks of midwives trying to save yet another child born into opulence and infection. It remembered the slow leaking death of a king too sacred to scrub. And now, with no one left to perform for, the air whispered those memories into the marble, into the bedding, into the wigs and gowns and powdered shoes. The ghosts of scent had taken over. But what's more tragic than a haunted palace is the people who choose to keep living in it, because they didn't leave. Not right away. They powdered again, perfumed again, rehearsed the ceremonies as if the absence of the sun was only a passing cloud. They told themselves France still needed the performance. That elegance was the antidote to unrest. That dignity could still be preserved in rot as long as the curtains were drawn and the windows stayed shut. And yet, the shutters began to crack. The staff changed more frequently. Servants quit in quiet waves. More guests left sick than arrived in awe. And every once in a while between the banquets, the rituals, the faux laughter, someone would glance toward the hallway where Louis had died and pause, just for a moment, as if listening for something they were no longer allowed to hear. That sound silence laced with truth was growing. You must understand, they didn't fear revolution yet. Not truly. Not the way we imagine. They feared irrelevance. They feared that the scent might now be louder than the music, that the myth might be decaying faster than the tapestries could be replaced. that the great lie perfume over poop was no longer fooling anyone but themselves. And still, they refused to clean. Because cleaning meant admitting, and admission meant collapse. So they did what dying regimes always do. They doubled down. They tightened the dress codes. They added new layers to the ceremonies. They held longer banquets, applied stronger scents, hired poets to write verses praising the palace as eternal glory, while rats chewed the drapery behind them. They built fountains to cover the smell, not realizing the water itself had grown stagnant. They replaced the staff, not with better workers, but with quieter ones. They wrote letters praising the king's lasting fragrance, ignoring that the scent of his embalmed body had never fully left the linen rooms. And beneath it all, the mold grew. Real mold, green, wet, sentient almost. It crawled up the edges of the tapestries, settled into the stone between the bathroomless bathrooms. It lived in the wig powder rooms where humidity clung to every surface and lice continued their silent dynasty. It colonized the wardrobes, grew bold in the servant quarters, bloomed gently in the corners of the court musicians' chambers. Mold has no concept of monarchy. It only knows moisture, warmth, and silence. Versailles offered all three in abundance. And the people? They breathed it in. Their lungs learned to adapt. Their noses forgot what real air smelled like. Children born after Louis's death assumed that sickness was simply the price of being noble. Women miscarried and prayed louder. Men lost their teeth and powdered their gums. The courtiers made toasts with infected mouths and held hands with fingers trembling from fevers no one dared name. And above it all, Versailles smiled. Because Versailles knew something they didn't. Versailles knew that rot, once it becomes ritual, no longer needs to hide. It becomes the standard, the perfume, the policy. And so, the palace had finally achieved what Louis could only dream of. Permanence. The rot had become tradition. There's something almost magnificent in how complete the lie became. Tourists today walk through Versailles and marvel at the ceilings, the furniture, the mirrors. They take photos of the Queen's chambers. They wonder at the decadence. But they don't ask about the smell. They don't ask where the shit went. They don't ask how many courtiers fainted from infection on that bed. They don't ask why the royal fountains were once clogged to the waist, or why no plumbing existed until long after the empire fell. Because we, too, are inheritors of the denial. We, too, love a beautiful corpse, so long as we can't smell it. But tonight, you can. If you're still here with me, if your eyes haven't glazed, if your soul hasn't flinched, and you smell it too, the afterscent. The phantom perfume of power dressed in rotting lace. It wafts not from the past, but from the memory of the past that refuses to be honest. You smell it every time history is told without its sweat. You taste it every time power is praised without its price. And once you've smelled it, you can't unsmell it. That's the curse of the awakened, and the gift. Because now, when you see a crown, you wonder what it's hiding. Now, when you hear the word luxury, you ask who cleaned the chamber pot. Now, when a king is praised, you wonder who changed his linens, who wiped his body, who pretended not to gag when the boils burst through the brocade. Now, you don't just see the mirror. You smell what's behind it. That, my dear sleepless soul, is how you unlearn rot. Not by rage, not by rebellion, but by remembering, by refusing to let perfume rewrite the past, by letting the scent speak. Because history has a smell, and tonight, it smells like this. And now we are here, aren't we? You and I still awake, still breathing, still holding the story together like a fragile thread pulled through time, blood, and musk. We've wandered through the shadowed hallways of a golden lie, followed the scent trail, behind brocade and marble, and we've arrived not at a grand revelation, not at some scholarly conclusion, but here, at the edge of a bed long since stripped, at the feet of a throne long since cold, at the final gasp of a myth that refused to be washed. And the question, the only question that matters now, is this: what do you smell? Not just in your mind, in your bones. In the soft part of your memory that recognizes things your mouth can't name. Is it rosewater? Mold? Is it powdered civet and warm flesh crushed beneath ceremonial lace? Or is it something older, something truer, something far less poetic? The smell of a world that would rather rot in beauty than face itself in the mirror. Because the story of Louis XIV was never really about Louis, not in the way we thought. It was about the cost of the performance, the price of insisting on divine perfection, even as your leg turns black. It was about a man who wrapped death in gold and asked the world to call it sunrise. And the world did, for a time. The echoes still exist. That's what people miss when they think history ends. It doesn't. It echoes. Through laws, through language, through rituals we no longer understand but still repeat. And most of all, through scentless things that once had a smell, but now only carry the memory of it. We inherit these echoes. We dress them up in modernity. We pretend they're clean now. We laugh at the filth of the past, like its scent is still clinging to the fabric of our world, just under a different name. But power still powders itself, doesn't it? It still perfumes over the rot. It still builds palaces with no toilets, and pretends the smell is someone else's fault. It still holds court, still stages the masquerade, still makes gods out of mortals, and then denies them water when they bleed. We're not far from Versailles. We're just better at marketing. And maybe that's why the smell still lingers. Not in your nose, but in your choices. In the things you're willing to believe because the alternative is too bitter. In the rooms you won't walk into. In the truths you powder over because they threaten the version of yourself that fits the frame. Louis XIV built a palace out of denial, and every time we say, "It's not that bad," when the rot begins to speak, we build one too. But this isn't about shame. No, that would be too easy. This is about awakening. About standing barefoot on the cold marble of the past and letting it speak to your skin. About knowing that the glamour came at the cost of breath. That a single scented handkerchief could buy silence for a century. That a man once ruled the most powerful nation in Europe and could not take a bath without risking his life. So he chose to stink in glory rather than live in fear. And everyone applauded because no one wanted to smell the truth. So they sprayed. And we still do. We spray when we lie to ourselves. When we dress up sickness as stoicism. When we call burnout a badge of honor. When we call cruelty leadership and loneliness independence. When we mistake packaging for purity. The scent has changed, but the instinct remains. To conceal, to deny, to decorate decay and call it resilience. We perfume our own pain now, don't we? Not with ambergris, but with captions. With curated smiles. With polite emails sent from collapsing chairs. With polite dinners served on tables built by people we'll never meet. You think this story was about hygiene. But hygiene was just the entry wound. The gateway to something deeper. Something raw. Something we all share, whether we wear crowns or not. The story was always about what we hide. What we choose to cover instead of clean. The corners of our history. The chambers of our psyche. The hallways we know better than to walk barefoot through, but walk anyway. Because there's music, because there's applause, because the floor is gold, and the air is thick with something that almost smells like belonging. But you stayed with me. You followed the scent. You crawled through the filth with me and didn't flinch. And for that, you now know what they didn't. That king's rot. That beauty deceives. That there's no such thing as sacred skin. That every performance leaves a stain and every perfume bottle eventually runs dry. You've seen the mold behind the mirror. You've met the god who couldn't wipe himself. You've looked power in the eye and smelled its underarms. And still, here you are. So what now? Do you wash, or do you spray? Do you carry this story forward as an anecdote, or as armor? Do you laugh about the sponges and chamber pots, or do you pause when someone asks you to pretend? Because history is not meant to be consumed. It is meant to be metabolized. It is meant to change your posture, your pace, your scent. And tonight, if I've done anything at all, I hope I've ruined something for you. Some quiet, sweet illusion you didn't know you needed to let rot. Some invisible lie about elegance or legacy or worthiness that you were still holding gently in your chest, like a rose petal that never quite smelled like one. I hope it crumbles now. I hope you stand in its dust and breathe deeper than you ever dared. And if one day you find yourself walking through a palace real or imagined, and the walls seem too clean, the mirrors too kind, the people too polished, I hope you stop. I hope you press your palm to the nearest curtain and ask aloud, softly, almost lovingly, what are they hiding beneath the scent? Because there's always something. No one sprays without reason. And when they do, you'll know. You'll know because you've been here, with me, at the end of the hall, past the portraits, past the chandeliers, past the velvet and the scripture and the coronation gowns, in the quiet, in the dark where the truth still smells like itself. Thank you for walking this far. Thank you for not turning away. And above all, thank you for breathing through it. You were not supposed to enjoy this. You were supposed to remember it. Now go, and let the world smell different to you forever.